Our next speaker is Simon Hannan, who's the director at Deloitte. This is someone who's actually worked in the Treasury, and I think one of the themes that comes through is how much this is driven by the centre of government, not just by the Education Department. On the productivity point, the Business Secretary, I think, or one of the ministers said on television last night, they put the productivity gap into dollars and said the difference between a UK worker and a United States worker was about $25,000. It was an extraordinary high figure. And I was, so perhaps you can shed some light on that, no pressure on you there. But Simon specialises in corporate strategy and execution with particular interest in further education and higher education. And we do need to remember the huge further education sector. At the moment, 11% of all degree level qualifications are delivered through further education colleges. And there are very important partnerships and potential changes there. However, Simon, over to you, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. Give me the website address for that automatic cocktail making machine. That sounds absolutely fantastic. I'm a consultant and I don't have any slides, so sorry. I'm just going to talk to you, and I won't even do it David Cameron style because I'm going to need to hold on to the lectern. So just a little bit about me and where I come from. So I'm a director in our education practice in Deloitte. I lead the strategy bit of our education practice, and that goes right from the very little ones in early years through schools into further education, higher ed and professional education as well. So our clients range from local authorities, multi-academy trusts, universities, business schools that certain people used to work at, and a range of others as well. So quite a broad practice. I've been in the firm for about 8 or 9 years now. Prior to that, I was in the Treasury, and while I was in the Treasury, we were having a heated debate with Number 10 about whether it should be student fees or a graduate tax. Number 10 was one of the few occasions Number 10 won in education in that period. And interesting to see how things have developed, of course, since then around university funding. I was asked to talk about the nature of demand and policy in 2025, and I immediately thought of Yoda, who said quite wisely, hard to predict the future is. And it is, and I think you referred to what normality was like in 2006, and to think about what normality might be in 2025 is very difficult. So I will speculate, and I will attempt to draw lessons from the past into what the future might actually look like. And I'll focus a bit on demand, some of the drivers of that demand, and also some thoughts on how the sector might respond. So that's going to be the nature of my approach here. I'm not going to talk too much about policy, not least because Hefke are sharing the podium with us. But I think that's even harder to predict than demand. So let's just give a bit of an overview first. As ever, the higher education sector is in flux. I think it's used to it by now. It's shown itself over the decades, centuries, close to millennia, that it is able to adapt and to respond to change. That change is accelerating, and I think the evidence shows, certainly since 2008, that so far the sector has responded really rather well, aided by government policy, particularly around things like removal of student number caps. It is still perceived, rightly, by the government, as you've seen, as a fundamental driver of the economic performance of the country as a whole. Its relative importance, in my view, is increasing as we move towards needing for the UK economy to compete at a much higher level than it has been able to in the past. And we've seen already that some of the advanced economies are moving ahead of us and have always actually been ahead of us in terms of productivity. We are still clearly punching way above our weight as an HE sector internationally. Apart from the US, we've got way more universities in the top 10, top 20, top 100. But that also is changing. And then I think you may disagree, but the sector as a whole financially remains in a reasonably strong position. The data shows that income and surpluses are rising. However, that kind of masks what is an increase in cost base, not least the university is having to respond to the kinds of demands that the students are placing on them now. That sector level health probably also masks quite a lot of stress at an institutional level. And not all universities clearly are thriving in the same way as some others. And what was quite interesting, we did a survey last year. Deloitte did a survey of FDs within the HE sector. And most of them said that their institution was fine, but that the sector as a whole was under stress. This was a feedback that commonly came back from almost every single FD. Someone somewhere's got that wrong. They can't all be fine and all be in trouble at the same time, which suggests that there's a degree of confusion around how the sector is actually responding. Let's look at some of the market factors. Underlying demand from students, the core students, the domestic 18 to 20-year-olds, that remains strong. And that remains strong despite a demographic dip. It remains strong for now. I think I'll come back to that in a minute. Policy and other innovations have helped, especially the removal of student number caps. The introduction of the fee, as you all know, the 9K top fee, had a temporary impact, but demand bounced back, and it is the new normality. The issue for us, I suppose, is that the response to date from the universities, while it has been sufficient so far, probably isn't sufficient for the sector to thrive and to continue to thrive, given the changing nature of the demand that's heading its way, given the changing nature of the economy into which you put your students. So let's look at demand. Demand will break down into volume and the type of demand, and the two things interact. We'll find between now, as you know, and 2020, the ONS tells us that year on year there will be fewer of the core demographic in the UK. Year on year, the cohort of 18 to 20-year-olds is smaller than it was the year before. That starts to bounce back in 2021, but it won't be at 2012 levels again until 2028. So you're going through a demographic dip. So by 2025, it'll be on the up again. Hooray. Challenge, I suppose, is that it'd be wrong to directly translate growing number of 18 to 20-year-olds with bouncing back demand for traditional university education. Several reasons for that. One, we've touched on it already. We don't think in 2025 the nature of provision will be at all what it is now. There'll be the emergence, hopefully, by then, of a range of different substitutes for what we might consider a traditional university education. Two things primarily that might look like. One, we've touched on it already. I think we are going to see masses of degree-level apprenticeships. And I think we're going to see a lot of children, young people, choosing not to go to university at all. And we are finding, so looking from a Deloitte perspective at the moment, we're actually starting to cut out the middleman. And we're not the only ones doing it. We are recruiting individuals direct from school and providing them with the kind of training that better suits our needs than we are finding is coming out of the sector as a whole. And in some cases, the students who come and join us also get a degree at the end. So there'll be a range of different types of provision, which will mean that although the number of students, potential students, is increasing, competition for those students, just in terms of the types of provision, will be greater, and it won't necessarily translate directly into demand. We also expect that the core undergraduate community may well change. We talk about that kind of domestic 18 to 20-year-old being the core, and we expect that to still be the same, but we also expect that that group of students might start looking elsewhere. The UK is remarkable. We only really export, I think the UK said, we only really export 1% of our students out of the UK, undergraduates, which is internationally quite a low number. There's an interesting story on the BBC yesterday, I think, it compared UCLA with UCLan. And it said once you take the Ivy League universities out of the picture in the US, the average fees are around $13,500, £8,500. So the comparator between UK provision and international provision, from a financial perspective, from a student perspective, even now, in real terms, isn't actually that much at all. And we are finding that, certainly from the people that we employ, that international outlook is much, much greater. We expect, flipping it over, that demand for UK university provision from international students will remain strong. One of the really interesting things for us, though, is whether international really just means Chinese. The effect of some of the visa restrictions that came in a couple of years ago, if you've had a look at it, is that there's still masses of international students coming to the UK, but the number coming from India has plummeted, and the number coming from China has increased at more than the rate from India has plummeted. So we still expect that, and that largely is being driven by the prestige of the UK sector. It is still perceived to be a good thing for an international student to study at a UK or a US school in order to facilitate their future career. That's just the number, and it's the number of students, potential students, and where they come from. But it's not really the real issue. Within that number, if it stayed static, the nature of demand, the type of demand is changing hugely. We're recruiting into Deloitte now people who were born in 1993. Ow. Smells Like Teen Spirit was referred to as a golden oldie on the radio yesterday as well. It made me feel absolutely dreadful. This isn't even Generation Z. This is Generation, I don't know where you go after Z. Alpha, Omega, who knows. But they are outstandingly consumer savvy. They have a very, very high perception of their own personal needs, demands, etc. Us as an employer need to respond to that. The traditional career paths of joining and then staying simply aren't there anymore. And many people join consulting because they don't know what they want to do, and they have an active desire to leave after 3 to 4 years. Now, it's not necessarily the same in every industry, but the students are incredibly aware of what is on offer to them, how much it costs, the value that they get from it, and they are going to be, in 2025, I think, the most picky and the most demanding group of students that we will have ever seen. And they won't just be choosing provision on the basis of the quality of the academic offer that's being provided, nor on the reputation of the university, nor on the course, although the nature of the course will still be one of the major drivers. They will start to see, because the fees will probably not be 9K then, they'll be significantly higher, and one might expect the cap possibly to have gone by then, and we'll have a real market rather than a quasi-market. But they will expect university to be a service and an experience that they value over the course of their time there, or potentially not, given the nature of the way that provision is changing. And much of what we're seeing, you may wish to reflect on it yourselves, but certainly in our clients, is this necessity at the university level to start to think about all of the other things that go around the student experience beyond simply the teaching and the learning. And the necessity for universities to start to compete on a whole range of different things rather than just look at our provision, isn't it great? So the nature of that demand will be absolutely critical. And I think, Nicola, you touched on it before, the requirement to see the value in the long run that what could be a potentially huge investment in the future will bring. We talk a lot about employability, but the clear line of sight between the experience at the university and future success is going to be even more a requirement in the future than it is now. And I think some of the trends, Nicola, that you were talking about are only going to accelerate over the next 5-10 years. Digital, I expect we'll talk about that later. There was a picture that was put up about the University of the Future, and it had a physical space on it, and I think you need a physical space for a picture. I think we're going to see a lot more of the kind of provision that's being piloted at Aston right now. What we think of as a university or as university provision will change quite radically. It's amazing actually how resilient university provision has been thus far to digital economy. Generally, it's still quite traditional in most places, but I don't think that's going to be sustainable over time, particularly this way as consumption patterns change. So let's just talk a little bit about how the sector might respond to all of that. I think there's some kind of what-ifs on this one, because the government also needs to respond and the sector needs to respond as well. We have not seen to date what I would call genuine strategic differentiation among universities in how they go to market to attract, retain students. Most universities have, in their mind's eye, a very similar looking strategy. They talk about digitizing, they talk about employability, comes up almost all the time. But real specialization in terms of the value that might be given to a student by course, shrinking to succeed perhaps, by price, by location, etc., etc. That kind of specialization, differentiation that happens commonly in the private sector doesn't happen currently in the HE sector, certainly not at scale. And most universities still have a we will be good at pretty much everything kind of strategy, although there are areas within many universities where they have a famous specialism. That's not the same thing as differentiating an offer in the market. And we would expect in 2025, given the changing nature of the demand, the much more consumer-led market, that differentiation within the sector will need to be significantly greater than it is now. You'll come on to later, I think, on your agenda, alternative provision. It is amazing how similar the provision is now to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of who provides. I think you'll have someone from BPP here later. They're one of the very, very few genuine new entrants in the market. I think we've seen 3 new entrants, BPP, University of Law, IFS, I think, possibly. Given there's a stated government policy to try and increase the plurality of the provision in the market, that's amazing. There are some very clear reasons why that's the case. Regulatory safeguards, quality, etc., acting as potential barriers to entry. There are some other things as well. It's very costly to enter the UK market if you're a new provider. The process of gaining taught degree awarding powers is painful. And then once you get them as an alternative provider, you're subject to a degree of scrutiny that those in the publicly funded sector simply aren't. So it's very costly to get, very costly to maintain. And of course, when it comes to university status, the gatekeepers are the existing providers, which creates its own incentives. We may well find in 2025 that kind of slow flow of new entrants into the market will have increased. However, we do expect that the main route in, as it is currently, is partnerships between private sector providers and the existing provision. As I said, there will be substitutes, employer direct, degree level apprenticeships, People may vote with their feet and simply not go to university anymore and seek their training from elsewhere. We will expect to see, either by hook through the levy or because they simply need it, employers taking a much more direct role in training their own workforces. I think we'll also see the increasing availability of international offers becoming more attractive, at least as long as we stay within the EU. I think there is an interesting consequence on the freedom of movement of students if we exit the EU. I don't know if that's something that's been considered yet, but you may find you've got a much more captive audience than you thought you had. May find it harder to recruit internationally, of course. We may see fewer universities in total. Failure, in the sense of universities folding, hasn't really happened in the UK. There are as many now as there were in 1992 and a few more besides, but there hasn't really been a plummeting number. I think we'll start to see some universities coming under quite a lot of stress financially. Some are already. There's a role for the regulators in helping here, but whereas we may not see universities go bust or fall over completely, I think we will likely see much more in the way of mergers, acquisitions, as a means of cutting costs and driving up economies of scale. We expect the market to become much more real and less of a quasi-market as it needs to respond and be more flexible to the type of demand that's coming. And we may see a separation of a sort of Champions League of the very best universities that will not be local, regional or national, but be genuine international universities, and they'll sort of separate themselves off from everybody else. Two other thoughts on what's provided rather than by whom. Nature of provision, we expect, will change completely. I won't dwell on this, you've heard it already, but technology won't be an add-on, it won't be a supplement, it won't be a way of enhancing a lecture-based or a classroom-based experience. It will become the experience. And at the same time, which is kind of a paradox, in order to continue to compete and to attract students, I think we'll find physical facilities improving massively as well, both within the classroom but also in terms of student accommodation, etc. I think we'll find much greater focus on STEM increasingly, which are actually more costly to provide. And I think we'll also see a much more unified experiential offer where the learning at the core, the content, actually becomes table stakes. It's the experience of as a whole of being at university or consuming higher education that will become central. And the reason for that is it's just going to be very expensive for students to continue to consume HE on the existing model. Technology actually opens up a range of alternatives. I think we'll find universities funding themselves increasingly in different ways. We are seeing universities increasingly looking towards alternative forms of income, and they've always said that they have, but philanthropy is slightly on the up, and looking at commercial sources of revenue, notably business schools, development of business schools, executive education, we're seeing on the up. So the nature of the demand is changing radically. We expect the nature of supply in response to that demand to change radically. Those that don't change or aren't able to change, we expect to come under more and increasing pressure. And we expect new entrants. So a much more competitive market, much more demand-led, much more consumer-driven. The language of customer or consumer, we expect, will cease to become dirty. But there's a huge amount we expect will have to stay the same as well. So just to finish on this, I don't think we'll find a world where quality is ever really compromised at all. The main reason, those within the sector say this, and we believe that, the main reason that UK continues to punch above its weight, yes, it's historical, but the fact is that education provision in the HE sector in the UK is better. than many other places, and a lot of that is to do with the quality and the safeguards that are within the system. The challenge is how to flex and amend those safeguards to deal with a much more complex demand environment. Nor can we consider a future, we think, where government and policymakers don't think that HE and skills development is important. It requires, there is a requirement for exactly the kind of skills development, tertiary education, in order for the economy to continue to compete. So there's quite a lot of positives to be built on. It's a very strong sector as it stands. It's just that we expect that the nature of provision to change, the nature of demand to change quite dramatically over the next 10 years. And some of the trends that we're starting to see now in 2016 to accelerate and become the norm quite a long time, we think, before 2025. Okay?
Thank you.